stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and chief story maker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, to connect. What we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. When you figure out which stories to share, difficult bosses and coworkers, successes, failures, the next step is to develop how you share them. Have you figured out your patterns, your roles in those successes, the discomfort and your challenges? In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you. You'll nod your head in understanding, and then we'll dig into the lessons from each of those. How many times have you been sharing a story only to be interrupted by a person eager to share his own? When I'm working with clients on communication skills, I remind them to listen for understanding, not to respond. But during this podcast, I'm asking you to listen and consider your own related stories, to listen and consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. Today's podcast episode is featuring Courtney Ackerman, and I'm really eager to get her talking about some of what she works with in terms of neuroscience. And so thank you for joining me, Courtney.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Well, it's funny because we met through my friend Jeff Eichler, and Jeff and I have been talking a lot about how our brains process information. And ever since I introduced him to Melissa Hughes, so when he introduced me to you, I was really excited, especially after reading that article. It's cognitive disruption, is that correct?
Distortions.
Cognitive distortions.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's start by the way that I like to start these podcasts is to ask you to share something about yourself that most people might not know. And the reason I ask that is so that our listeners get a little bit of context for who you are and how you think.
Well, it's kind of hard to pick something that most people might not know. All right, I'll give you one that most people probably don't know and probably wouldn't guess, especially with my focus on positive psychology. Mm-hmm. I am a big reader, and my number one favorite author is Stephen King.
Oh, that's hilarious.
I just am absolutely in love with Stephen King's books.
That is so funny.
Yeah, I own almost every one that he's ever written and have read almost all of them as well. Don't know what it is about him. I just love the guy.
He's compelling.
He is. He writes good characters.
What was the first book you read? Yes. And I like that his characters are all flawed. So.
They are. Some of them deeply so, and that makes them so much more interesting. The first Stephen King book I read, I think, was Pet Sematary.
Oh.
Yeah. Ooh. Chilling one.
The first Carrie. I remember being, really uncomfortable, but compelled to keep reading.
Yes. I think that's a good way to describe how you feel when you read some of his books.
Yeah, you kind of want to see how it ends. Uh-huh. Oh my gosh. Yes. Okay. So you caught me on that one. That is definitely not something I would have picked. And I'm running through my head as you were setting that up, like books that I really enjoy reading. I'm running through my head about the most unlikely authors, and Stephen King wasn't even at the top.
Wasn't even on the list.
Wasn't even on the list. That was going through very quickly through my head.
Oh, well, so I picked a good surprising fact then.
You did. I like that. So before we get started into some of the stories that you're going to share with us today, I'd love to hear a little bit about what you do professionally.
Okay, so what I do professionally is a bit of a grab bag right now. I work full-time at a health-related agency for the state of California, and there I do research on healthcare workforce trends. I help evaluate some of our grant programs for residency programs and mental health loan assumption programs, and sort of a wide variety of the programs that we run. And then in my sort of side work, my freelancing career, I do some writing for some positive psychology related websites. I also do some survey research consulting. So I help people anywhere in the process, from I think I need a survey for this to, analyzing the results of the survey and reporting out on it. I love to help people anywhere in that process. And then most recently, I've written a few books. So that's probably the most exciting thing that I've been doing lately. But yeah, I take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and I do a lot of different things, which keeps it interesting.
And are your books focused on the positive psychology?
Yeah, they are. They're very, very focused on ways that you can apply positive psychology in your daily life.
Oh, awesome. Tell me just a little bit about what positive psychology represents.
So, positive psychology, sort of a subfield of psychology itself, but it's also an answer to psychology because for decades, going back to the 30s and 40s, traditional psychology has really focused on the negative, on the abnormal, on things that aren't going well. And there's good reason for that. We had World War II going on during that time. We had a lot of people coming back with trauma. We had a lot of difficult things that we had to deal with as a country and as a world, really. But I think we got a little bit too caught up in focusing on what can go wrong and not paying much attention to what can go right. So that's what positive psychology was founded as. Not a replacement for psychology, but sort of a what's on the other side of the coin. So we know about the outliers in the negative direction, but what about the outliers in the positive direction? It's all about studying what can go right with people, how people thrive, looking at the people that are just incredibly successful and do amazing things and studying them instead of sort of discounting them from the data because they're an outlier.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And it's something that actually is a great complement to what I'm doing as a certified strengths coach with that Gallup tool, Strengths Finders. Because the premise is the guy that created it, Don Clifton, he says that we've been focusing on the wrong thing in education all of these years. In public education, we always go into what are our strengths and our weaknesses, and let's maintain our strengths and improve on our weaknesses. And he said, that's all wrong. We really need to focus on our strengths and get better, really inclined to do well. Because it doesn't matter how much we focus on something that we're not so good at, we're never going to be as good at that as somebody who does that well and naturally.
Right.
So it makes more sense to complement our strengths rather than trying to be all things to all people.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And it's certainly not licensed to ignore certain areas where you might be a little weaker. We all sort of need a baseline level
right of
competence.
Yes.
Yeah, competence.
And I think the way that I'm kind of correlating this to positive psychology is that no matter what you're doing, you can be good at it if you take the approach that is your natural inclination to take.
Right.
So in other words, if you are trying to be good at bookkeeping, not great at numbers, you can figure out a way to get from point A to point B that uses the strength that you have in, say, analytics or people skills, soft skills. How can you apply that to get from point A to point B? It's going to look a lot different from somebody who's naturally gifted in that area.
Right. Yeah.
So
good points.
So with positive psychology, it's the same thing that you can really focus on how people are doing things well, what's working, so that we can apply that to people who are not doing things well and help them learn what works for others. So
right. It's true that focusing on the people that are succeeding can also tell us more about how to help people who are not.
Exactly. Ooh, cool. So I have to ask you the question: when you think about certain times in your life that change the way you see yourself in the world, your world, is there a particular point that you think, and a specific experience that you had that made you realize you wanted to focus in on that area of study?
I'd say that there isn't really a big moment. I'd say it's a lot of little moments gradually building up. I have actually another thing you might not guess. I'm really not the most optimistic person. If I had to classify myself, or if I took one of the many tests out there that tell you what your outlook is, I usually fall towards the pessimist side of the spectrum. And it's just sort of in my nature to look at situations and come up with all of the ways that things can go wrong.
Mhm.
And that's not necessarily a terrible thing. You can kind of be a realistic pessimist and still, have a good and happy life. But I think my natural inclination to focus on the negative is what got me interested in the positive. It got me wondering whether that's sort of a natural inherent quality, or whether that's something that you can change, whether that's something you can work with, or whether you're just out of luck if you're born kind of pessimistic like me. I think it was a lot. It was just
So
a lot
did
of moments that built up to
so there
an
must
interest.
be a conversation that pops into your head sometimes when you think about that, in terms of somebody who said something to you like, why do you have to be such a pessimist? Or somebody who was important to you that had a conversation with you about.
Yeah, I can think of a couple of family members. Maybe we'll just leave it at family members who are dearly, beloved to me and wonderful people. But I struggled with depression as a teenager, and I'm sure that contributes to the pessimism. And a couple of these family members would say, "What's wrong? Just choose to be happy." And it would just frustrate me to no end. Thinking, well, I can't just choose to be happy. And I think that's probably one of the big reasons, one of the big things that sparked my curiosity into, wait, can we really choose to be happy? Maybe we can.
And what do you think now?
I think that we definitely have some control over it, more than we think we do. There's certainly a genetic component to happiness, but we have a lot more control over how we respond to things than we generally think that we do.
Mm-hmm. So I'm imagining you as a teenager, sullen teenager. And
At
I'm
times.
imagining, yeah, well, we all were at times. I don't know any teenagers that don't have at least phases that they go through like that. Even my most optimistic, happy son, I have two boys, and one is the happier one. And he definitely went through a period of depression and sullenness and anxiety. So I definitely get that. And I'm thinking of a particular interaction I had with my younger son when I could sense that he was kind of pulling away from me, that he was trying to establish a particular boundary between us, because we've always been very, very close.
Mm-hmm.
And he would say mean things to me. Like, we would be sitting at the dinner table and I would say something and he'd tease me, and not in a nice way. It would be kind of mean and it would hurt my feelings.
Yeah.
And I remember a particular moment where that hurt my feelings. And I said, wow, that really hurt my feelings. I don't know why you would say something so mean. And he said, it's not mean, it's just true. And I remember looking at him and saying, well, you can be truthful without being hurtful. And he walked away from the table. It was his job that night to clean the kitchen. So he cleaned it up and his brother helped him. And then he went upstairs, and I had that realization that this was a moment, that it was a time when he was establishing a boundary with me, setting himself apart from me. In some ways, he was getting older.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember walking into his bedroom and leaning over to give him a kiss on the head, and he moved.
Oh.
And my eyes filled with tears. Totally random. Like, I'm not a crier necessarily, but it was an interesting conversation because I said, you have a choice. And if you need to separate yourself from me, if you need space from me, you need to just give me a cue that's not mean.
Mm-hmm.
If you're feeling that desire to set a boundary, just say, Mom, I need some space. Touch your nose with your finger. I don't know, something, if you can't use your words, to tell me when you need your space. And I remember walking away from that, really thinking intensely about how our choices impact our relationships when it comes to that kind of mentality.
Right.
So I'm guessing you had a conversation like that with one of your family members when you were in that establishment. Do you remember a vivid moment like that?
Um, I can't really remember any vivid moments like that aside from the just be happy. That's the one that's the one that sticks out.
Do you remember when you were when they said that to you?
Oh, I do. Yep. I was standing outside in our backyard.
And was it nighttime or daytime?
It was daytime. It was one of those days where the sun was shining and everything was great, and it should have been a real nice, happy day. And I just wasn't. I was grumpy. I was just not feeling good, not feeling well about life, and this family member. We'll keep it very vague.
Yes, of course.
Just be happy.
Yeah. Well, I have accidentally said that before. I was saying you have a choice. You really do have a choice. And so I'm feeling particularly connected to your story right now.
Well, yes. And there are things that people say that would make a lot of sense and that would be helpful for us if we heard them in the way that we could accurately interpret them. Because what that family member was saying to me was, you have a choice in how you respond to things. I know that you're struggling, but you can make a choice and make the effort and still try to, salvage the day and feel happy. But that is not what I got out of it.
Right. And that's all that matters. Your perception is all that matters in that situation.
Right.
Their intention doesn't even play a small role in it. It's all how you're perceiving it at that moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's true with everything. It's funny. Just today I had a little experience, not like on that level, but where you intend something to sound a certain way and it comes out and it sounds very different. A coworker was out for a few hours during the middle of the day, and I was kind of looking for him, and he came back. And I saw him walking in, and I said, "Hey, where have you been?" And to me that was concern. That was, oh my gosh, I missed you. I didn't know where you went. Are you okay? And he looked a little taken aback, and he was like, "Yeah, I was fine. I was just at home, waiting for a package to be delivered." And then I went, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I'm so nosy."
And that came out wrong.
It came out very wrong. I'm very sorry. I don't mean to, I don't mean to be nosy. I was just concerned and it didn't come out right. I think that happens to all of us multiple times a day, whether we know it or not.
So you recognized his expression. Was it like a body language or was it cue?
It was both. It was definitely both. He kind of took a step back a little bit and kind of did that, maybe like cocking your head a little bit, kind of like what? what did you just say?
Scooby-Doo.
Yeah. And then he said, "Where have I been, or how have I been?" And then that's when I knew. Oh boy, that came out wrong.
Oh, see,
you don't have to tell me either. I just wanted to make sure you're okay.
I think you're so fortunate, Courtney. This sounds like a person that is really comfortable that he could make that expression and say, "Is that what you meant to say?" Because a lot of people would have that would have been a dismissal right on that moment. This is not my friend.
Right. True. I am very lucky. I have some pretty great coworkers. And he's definitely one of them.
I wish I could always respond that way.
I wish I could too.
Yeah.
One of my goals really is to keep that in mind when people say something that to me sounds a little off or maybe a little insensitive or even rude. To try to put myself in their shoes, just take a second. They might have a completely different meaning.
Right. Their intention is not how you're taking it necessarily.
Right. So it's a good reminder when you have one of those moments yourself to take a few seconds, maybe check in with this person or maybe just in your own head, think about some other alternatives.
Right. And stop overanalyzing.
Yeah. Well, good luck. Some of us are just destined to overanalyze, I think.
We're just born that way.
Yeah, just born that way.
So after you kind of got through that depression, you kind of worked your way out of it. You did have a moment where you realized, oh, wait a minute, I do have a choice. Do you have any vivid memories about making that choice?
Hmm. I think it's sort of a constant learning process. Um, for me, there were definitely some moments where I realized that I had a choice, and took action. But then later, I'll find myself sort of sliding back into a more passive outlook,
Mm-hmm.
and then I'll have another moment, where I realize, no, wait, no, I have control. And then, it's ups and downs of life, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think there was a moment. I'm trying to remember. I think it was after reading a certain book or something. It'll come to me at some point.
Well, I'm reminded again of a story with our younger son where I was seventh grade, and we were dropping him off and then dropping off his older brother at the high school just a few blocks further.
Hmm.
And the older brother had left something out. The younger brother stubbed his toe on it that morning, and it was this big drama. It was like, you shouldn't have left that out. Now my foot hurts. And it was, I'm sure there were other things going on that were triggering that overreaction, but all the way to school, he was grumpy about Jacob this and Jacob that. And when we got to his school, he reached across the car to kiss me, which was, whew, thank goodness.
Uh-huh.
Before he established that boundary, I suppose. But he said, he said something about Jacob shouldn't have. And I looked at him, I said, you know what, Max? You can spend the whole day in that mood, blaming Jacob for the start of your day being bad. You could spend the whole day like this. That's your choice. And if that's where you are and you want to do it, just know that you're making it an intentional choice to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Your other option is to decide that what happened this morning is just this morning and that the rest of the day isn't going to be affected by it. That's your other choice, so that you can actually have a good day and enjoy your time with your friends at school.
Mm-hmm. And what choice did he make?
No, this is your choice. Well, it was funny. He looked at me and he got very quiet for a second, and he got just a little corner of his mouth going up. It wasn't a full smile. He said, I know, Mom, I have a choice. And he walked away. And I don't know exactly, of course, I don't know what happened, but I've always said to our boys that you can give yourself some time to wallow, that there's no reason to jump right into optimism if that's not what you're feeling, but that wallowing has to be intentional, that you have to know that you're doing it, and that you can take that time, but then focus on what are you going to do next. And when he said, that's pretty good. That was a moment that I realized that I wasn't always practicing when I was preaching. When you talk to your children and you give them this sage advice and you think you're so brilliant with it, then you walk away and go, why didn't I listen to that myself?
We're always better at giving advice than we are at taking it.
Yeah, definitely.
I think that's really important, that what you said about if you're not ready to be optimistic and positive, then go ahead and wallow, be negative, be, self-pitying, whatever you need to be, but do that intentionally. And I think something that was probably unspoken, but there is that, and that period will end at some point.
Right. Exactly.
Right. I mean,
you time limit.
you will come out of it, whether you set yourself a time limit or you just, let yourself just sit and wallow. Eventually there's going to be a moment where you're like, I don't want to do this anymore.
Right. I hope so. And a big part of that is, who do you want to be around you? Because if you are a wallower and you stay in that place, those are the people that are going to be attracted to you, are other wallowers.
Right.
And then it just exacerbates it. But if you really want to be around people who are optimistic, people who are empowered and empowering, then you have to get out of that wallowing at some point, because they're not going to want to spend time with somebody who's constantly complaining or wallowing.
Absolutely. Like attracts like.
Yeah, it does. So now I'm really curious, what got you started into positive psychology? Was there, was it one of those moments where you read a book or where you had a conversation with somebody and went, oh, aha?
Again, I know I wish I had better moments to talk about.
We'll find them.
You'll dig through. You'll
We'll
dig through
dig.
and find some. Well, I think that one moment where I realized that I think we really do have a choice in how we respond to things, and also something that eventually led me to positive psychology, where that's a big factor, is that we can choose how we respond to things that happen to us. I realized that I am not my emotions, and I think I don't. Have you heard of the website Quora?
Yeah, the questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I absolutely love that website. And I was following someone, and she had this excellent answer on how you are not your emotions and that you can feel something, but it's still you feeling them, and that you are actually removed from those emotions naturally. You're a step from them because you are the being that is feeling them. You are not them.
Hmm.
And that means that you have a choice in what you do with them. And that was just so mind-blowing for me. I had just never thought of it in those terms before, especially as a teenager, when you don't tend to think too deeply about things like this. I would feel really down and depressed and just think that, well, this is just how I feel and there's nothing I can do about it.
And that's just kind of resigned to it.
Yeah, resigned to it. Learned helplessness, if you follow Martin Seligman at all.
So cognitive distortion, there must be one, if you can describe what that is and then maybe talk about one of your own that you discovered as a result of this. Would you mind going into that?
Sure. Yeah. So cognitive distortions are these core beliefs that we have about the world and the way it works, or about ourselves, that are not rooted in reality. They're not reasonable. They're not logical. But we base all of the decisions that we make and everything we experience off of our core beliefs. But core beliefs can be sneaky because you don't necessarily consciously think about them. They just sort of form that foundation of the pyramid that is you, and you don't necessarily always see the foundations. But there's a lot of different cognitive distortions that were identified, mostly by David Burns and Aaron Beck, two of the pretty big names in counseling and clinical psychology. So there's a big list of them. I think there's 11 that are sort of officially recognized, and then there are a few more that people talk about a lot. I think one of the ones that I have struggled with is overgeneralization. So I take something that happens in one little area of my life, like say, I was a total overachiever in school, and straight A student. So when I got a C one time on a calculus test, it was a big deal. It was an attack on my identity almost as the straight A student. And so instead of saying, well, you know what, maybe I didn't study hard enough, or maybe calculus just isn't my thing, I think, oh my God, I'm dumb. I'm I'm not a good student, I guess. I'm not as smart as I thought I was, and I'm a failure, and all those negative thoughts that are ridiculous on the surface, or well, ridiculous all the way through, but in the moment, it makes some sort of twisted logic to you, and then you take that one little thing. Okay, I didn't do so well in this, and you generalize it to your overall self, your global self, right? So I suck at math. I suck.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's something most people struggle with, is having that one piece of evidence that outweighs all the other evidence that points the other direction.
Right. Absolutely. It's because we have that bias towards remembering the negative. So you can get 100 compliments, but you're going to remember that one insult best of all.
Oh my, all the time. As a matter of fact, my podcast last Tuesday, not yesterday, but not this week, but last week, was about singing the national anthem and messing up one note. and
Oh no.
and just assuming that I was a terrible singer, and why would anybody ever want to hear me sing? And
Oh.
and that actually it happens every time. Every time. If it's pretty rare to have somebody say something negative after they've heard a performance, but
Mm-hmm.
you hear just one negative comment and you just decide to throw in the towel. Okay, forget it. I'm hurting people when I'm singing. Why am I doing this?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, it's unfortunately
totally makes
easy.
sense. It is. So how do we battle that? I mean, obviously, if we're conscious of it, if we that points in the other direction.
Right. That, it's definitely step one is identifying that it's there. And I think a lot of people, if they haven't gone to therapy, or if they're not just sort of introspective individuals already, they might not spend much time thinking about it. I certainly didn't spend a lot of time thinking about my core beliefs until I went to therapy. But taking the time to identify those faulty core beliefs, those cognitive distortions, those ways that we see the world that are just not quite right, definitely is the first step, because you really can't do anything about it until you know what it is and how it's affecting you. There are a lot of different ways to address them, but some of the most popular ones are like taking your thoughts that stem from one of your cognitive distortions, like, I suck, right? I suck at math. That means I suck. And then writing it down and then changing it to reflect reality. So instead of, I suck at math, so I suck at life, you might write, math is not my strong suit, but that's okay because I have other skills.
Oh, okay.
So it's not ignoring the fact that you failed, or you had something bad happen to you. You maybe didn't study as hard as you should have. It's not glossing over that fact. It's acknowledging it and then saying, "But that's okay."
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't mean that that I suck everywhere else.
Right. Well, again, it comes right back to another situation where we behave badly. I'm thinking about me in one particular situation where I had that regret about doing something that I shouldn't have done, or saying something I shouldn't have said. And then thinking I'm a horrible person because
Mm-hmm.
I did this one thing.
Yes. That little one thing outweighs all of the other good things that you've done.
Right. Right. What's another one of the cognitive distortions?
There is all or nothing thinking, or black and white thinking. So, related to what you just said, you're either a wonderful person or you're a terrible person. And that can apply to you, and it can also apply to other people. Seeing people and judging them by their worst mistake, or by their greatest success. So someone hurts you and you go from thinking that they're just the greatest thing since sliced bread to thinking that they are just the worst human being that has ever lived. that's all or nothing, or black and white thinking. And of course it's not always that pronounced. But we do tend to do that because it's easier, I think, for our brains to handle, right? Putting people in categories.
Yeah, we see that a lot in politics.
Right, absolutely. Yeah,
Okay,
we're
what's
good.
another one? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, we're just good at categorizing things, and I think our brains just sort of like to do that. So it can be a challenge sometimes to get them to stop categorizing everything and trying to find labels and buckets for everything.
Right. Yeah, I've been talking about that for a long time. It started bothering me, probably about 10 years ago, when I started really reading more and more about how people generalize generations.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started hearing the descriptions of millennials, which I am not a millennial, I'm significantly older than a millennial. And but everything that they would describe as far as wanting more intrinsic reward, wanting more flexibility, wanting to love what they do, and I thought, well, I've always been like that, and
Mm-hmm.
so that started really bothering me, and so I can see how this black and white image, especially because it leads right into the generalization as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, it's easy to do that, but unfortunately, but it doesn't help.
No, definitely doesn't help. And it confirms our bias because it's so much easier that way.
Right.
So what's
Unfortunately.
another cognitive distortion?
So another one that's pretty common are control fallacies. And there's two of them. There's the fallacy of internal control and then the fallacy of external control. And internal control is all about we think that we're responsible for everything that goes wrong. You know, if you come home and your spouse is grumpy, it must be because you did something wrong. Or, you know, if a project at work didn't go well, it must be something that you did. It's just taking everything that happens around you and believing that you are personally responsible for it, which is clearly not true, but it's insidious. It's an insidious little thought.
Do you find that all Virgos have that?
You know, I actually don't really follow signs at all, so possibly. Not that I've personally noticed.
I have a whole theory around why horoscopes can tend toward accuracy, but it has to do with when you're born, the time of year you're born, and what you're exposed to at certain developmental stages of life. So,
Interesting.
but I threw that out as a joke on Virgos that like to, for some reason, has a tendency to feel like everything reflects on them, whether it's good reflection or bad reflection. Everything somehow reflects back to them, and so that's what that made me think of.
Well, yep, sounds like they might have a fallacy of internal control.
Yeah, I think so. So what's the external control fallacy?
So the external control fallacy is just the opposite. It's thinking that you have no control over anything that happens to you or to anyone around you. It's you're just helpless. You're a victim of fate, and there's nothing you can do to change it.
Huh. Yeah, I know some people like that.
I think we all do. We all have the tendency to get that way sometimes. You know, well, it's not my fault. You know, this happened because X, Y, and Z, but not me. You know, it wasn't me.
Right.
But
right. You know, what's interesting about that is, and I don't want to get too deeply into this discussion on religion, but it really does play a role here, because that has existed since the dawn of time, or the dawn of humanity. I would think this ability to relinquish your control in that way. And I'm thinking specifically of a time when there was a kid that was growing up in a very religious household at school with our oldest son, and he was telling our oldest son, you're in devil's character. And when I asked my son about it, he said something about, oh, well, he said this and that about the devil. And I said, well, you know, Jewish people don't actually believe in a devil. And my son was a little puzzled by that. And I said, well, Jews don't believe in the devil because Jews believe that we are all capable, that we all have the capacity for both good and evil. Mm-hmm. And that every time something comes up, we have a choice to lean into one side or the other. And that there's no external factor to take responsibility for something that we choose to do. And I think he was in fourth grade at the time. And I knew he was a little puzzled by my answer, but he definitely got the gist of it. Mm-hmm. And so that your description of that external control really brought me right back to that idea of hating personal.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really excellent point. It's something that I've sort of noticed as well. And it's not just religion. It can also be people who believe in, you know, karma, or people who believe in luck, or whatever, whatever their sort of outlook is. But I think there's a human tendency to try to find a scapegoat, to try to find a reason for our bad behavior. And sometimes
so we don't have to own it.
Right. So we don't have to own it. So we don't have to feel like it's our fault.
Mm. Wow. This could go in so many different directions, this conversation.
It really could.
So I'm just going to lean back into your stories. A moment that you remember, a person you talked to that you were realizing that you were being manipulated, or that you were being manipulated.
Mm-hmm.
And what was that? What was the moment? What was the moment that you realized that you were being manipulated? What was the moment that you realized that you were being manipulated? What was the moment that you realized that you were being manipulated? you were on the right path in studying cognitive distortions and in particular within positive psychology. Have you had a conversation with somebody that really kind of lit you up?
I think I've had a lot of conversations that I would say lit me up, but the one that really made me go, okay, I'm in the right place, was talking with a professor at Claremont, where I went to graduate school, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, which don't ask me to spell it. I used to know, but now it's CSZ something or other. But if you don't know that incredibly long and difficult to pronounce name, he is the father of flow, that
Oh.
concept of losing yourself entirely in an activity. And it's when your skill meets the challenge at hand, and you lose all track of time and just are
Mhm.
totally absorbed in the activity. And then he also happens to be sort of the co-founder of the field of positive psychology. So I was very, very fortunate to be able to take classes from him while I was at Claremont. And his personal story, if you could get him on here, that's a good one.
Oh, okay.
he he grew up in, oh boy, I think Hungary. Yeah, he's Hungarian. I think he grew up in Hungary during World War II. And so he remembers a lot of it, and he remembers escaping basically just in time. He remembers seeing a lot of terrible things, a lot of trauma, a lot of death and despair around him. But what he noticed and what he focused on was all the people that bounced back and thrived after that. Um, and that really, it was really moving. It was wonderful to hear his story and to realize that my sort of focus on the negative can sort of be married with a similar focus on the positive, I guess. Because of course, without the negative, we wouldn't have post-traumatic growth or resilience or any of these things, any of these positive things that come after something negative happens.
Hmm. So you got to take a class with him. Did you ever get to actually have a conversation with him?
Yes, yeah, and boy, is he just brilliant. He was just telling more about his life story and about what led him to study what he studies. Um, and it's just one of those moments where you know that you're talking to someone who is not only brilliant but incredibly passionate about what they do. Someone who has really found their life's work, and it's so energizing.
Mm, definitely. Even if it's not your life's work,
Right.
being in the same room with somebody that feels that way is energizing and empowering.
Very
Hmm.
much.
So when you left school, was there something you did shortly after that that again kind of awoke that passion for what you wanted to do?
I don't think anything happened. I don't think anything big really happened right after I left school. Um, I think I just sort of kept uh, that little bit of fire for positive psychology. I was working for or in retirement research when I first got out of school. So I was using the research part of my degree, but not so much the positive. Um, but doing retirement research, you run into a lot of interesting things about aging and positive aging, which is a huge part of positive psychology. And so I think I stumbled upon the old studies. Now I can't remember his name. It starts with a V. It was a professor at Harvard who did a really long-term study of like 70 years of I think hundreds of men to see what the real factors are in having a happy life and having a good life. Um, and stumbling upon those findings again that I hadn't seen in a while reminded me that his biggest finding is that it's relationships. It's the people in our lives. It's the relationships that we have with them that can really make or break, having a good life, however you want to define good life. Um, And that I guess that sort of reignited my interest in positive psychology, specifically in positive relationships. And that includes having a positive relationship with yourself, because I think we tend to not put ourselves in that category of relationships, but the most important relationship we have is certainly the one with ourselves, because that's the one that everything else is based on.
Right. Right. I think it all comes down to being comfortable in your skin, knowing yourself, but understanding where your patterns might be getting in your own way.
Right.
Hmm. And that's where those cognitive distortions come in. When you're more aware of them and more aware of those patterns, then you can shift your thinking enough to be able to build stronger, healthier relationships with the people around you.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Oh, that makes so much sense. And then, kind of stories that we tell, and the stories that we tell aren't just the stories that people hear, but it's the stories we tell ourselves. And if we're telling ourselves a story that because I failed this calculus test, I'm terrible at math, or I'm a horrible person, or I'm not very smart, then that it's not just when I tell somebody that, oh, I'm not very smart because I failed this calculus. That person that's in front of us may change their perception of us, but even worse, you're continuing that misperception in yourself.
Right. Yeah, and that's the biggest problem.
I just read an article by a guy named Christian Jarrett with a Jarrett, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And he's in the UK, and he's studying the way we tell stories. He's studying storytelling. And the concept in this article was that the way we tell our stories and the stories we choose to tell actually shape our personalities, and not the other way around.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. I'm trying to get in touch with him so that I can have him on the podcast if he'd be willing to do it. But that's exactly the concept that I've been sharing and suggesting for about 5 years as I've been working on storytelling as a storytelling coach, is that the stories that we tell shape us. And the stories themselves don't define us, but how we tell them defines us. And it's just exciting to hear what you're doing, the work that you're working on with cognitive distortions, and being able to shift that in our heads once we recognize them. It all is so complementary in terms of getting people to better understand their role in their successes and failures, and being able to improve relationships as a result of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think cognitive distortions are all about the stories that we tell ourselves and how we talk to ourselves in general. I think there's a big tie in there.
Wow. I think we're going to have to continue this conversation another time.
I would love that.
Well, this was terrific, Courtney. I so appreciate your taking the time to visit with me.
Yeah, no problem.
But for our listeners, I will have some links to Courtney's books and her LinkedIn profile, so that if you want to reach out and maybe connect with her, or at a minimum follow her and learn more about what she's writing and studying and researching. So thanks again, Courtney. Do you have anything else you'd like to add?
No, just thanks for having me. I really, really enjoyed our discussion, and I think that what you're doing is fascinating as well. I love stories. I love telling them. I love hearing them, and I'd love to learn more about what that means about me.
Oh, well, I guess we're definitely going to have to schedule another conversation.
Will do.
Thank you, Courtney.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away? Don't say